Okay, let's open a word of prayer. Lord, thank you so much for this day. We pray that you'll bless our time together as we discuss some pretty heavy topics. And we just pray that you always keep us in mind that you are in control and that you've not given us a spirit of fear. But prepare our hearts for the things that we see coming in the near term. Bless us today in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, today I'm going to call this Catastrophe upon Catastrophe. And there's a lot of different things going on. And so I don't want to be particularly dark, but there are a lot of things that are happening, some of which I have slides for, and honestly, some of which I didn't have time to make slides for because there was just so many different things that were happening. So let's look at this. This is a reminder. These are some of the channels and places that you can find us. And again, we're still working towards getting a podcast, but we are all volunteers here, so that makes, there's only so many hours in the day. I've long advocated that those of us, there's a number of people that do prophecy updates. I watch some of them, and it would be nice if we all had a clearinghouse where we could go and get things, because the ones that I talk to, everybody sort of does it on their own, or maybe they have a couple people on their staff helping them. But the volume of information and reports and intelligence reports and briefings and analyses and things are just absolutely overwhelming. So maybe that'll happen someday, but it'll probably be about 20 or 30 years into the millennium, I think, at the rate things are going. So we do talk about the convergence of events and the acceleration of things that are happening, that, and this is similar to the way Jewish prophecy operates. Jewish prophecy, the way Jewish prophecy operates in the Bible is very often it will set up a pattern. And so one of the patterns that we have is that that what happened at the time of the first coming of Christ will be what's happening at the time of the second coming of Christ. And at the first coming of Christ, in a very short period of time, during his coming, there were a bunch of prophecies, and these prophecies were fulfilled. About 60% were fulfilled in the last week. And we've been talking about that in first hour. We're in that time in the life of Messiah, that last week. And so everything was kind of compressed and happening very quickly then. And it'll be similar to the second coming of Christ. There's a lot of prophecies that are out there, and we're just going to see them starting to be put in motion and that sort of thing as we get closer. And again, this is sort of what I have come up with, this prophecy ACLU, I call it. By the way, the regular ACLU is just, I get their emails, and it doesn't stand for anything that it used to stand for. So so we have these things that are, excuse me a second. So we have these acceleration, convergence. Things will be happening like all at the same time. And so we could say, I could have said convergence of catastrophe upon catastrophe, or convergence of catastrophes. I could have titled that this week. There's also a logistics thing. We'll talk a little bit about that. That before certain prophecies are fulfilled, there has to be a buildup. So if there's a big army that's talked about, there has to be a big army buildup. It just doesn't materialize overnight. And we can base some of these things on our experience in this world, and then understanding as we get closer, we will have understanding, as it says in Daniel chapter 12. And I'll allude to some passages today that might bring to mind some of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, particularly the third and fourth horsemen. In fact, let me just read this passage from Revelation chapter 6 about the first four seals. So it'll just be Revelation chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the four living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a white horse. He who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him. He went out conquering and to conquer. And this is why one of the things that I say is that these seals, you don't open the seal and then boom, immediately everything regarding that seal is fulfilled. Because it says here that the rider on the white horse goes out conquering and to conquer. So it's a process that's there. And then the second seal, verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come and see." Another horse, fiery red, went out, and it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. Then the third seal, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, a day's wage, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." And then the fourth seal, which is widespread death on the earth. And I'm not sure I agree exactly with that characterization that's in the headers here in the translation that I'm reading from. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come and see." So I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him, and power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Now, my view on that, some people will say that means a fourth of the earth's population will die. So if we live in a world of 8 billion people, that would mean during the fourth seal, 2 billion people would die. Now, I'm not saying there will be a lot of death that will come as a result of that, but I don't agree with the conclusion that the fourth of the earth is reference to the numbers of the percentage of the population that's going to die. It's talking about the scope of the authority that's given to this rider on this horse, and it's over a fourth of the earth. Now, there's a couple ways to do that. You might say it's a fourth of humanity, which raises some interesting conclusions. Islam has about a fourth of humanity. Does that mean that this rider has authority over the Islamic world? Another way of looking at it, my friend Doug Hamp holds to this position, is that a fourth of the earth means a fourth of the earth's surface. And a fourth of the earth's surface, actually about 24.7% of the earth's surface, is land, which means that this ruler will have control over all of the land on the earth. There'll be a world leader. And I think that view has some validity. But it's the scope of his authority over the fourth of the earth, not necessarily that he kills a fourth of the earth. He has the power to do that. And there'll be a number of ways that will happen. It talks just, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. And that's an interesting talk there, too, about the beasts of the earth, but I won't go into that now. So let's just look at some of the things that are going on. Now, we've had this very divisive non-decision of the Supreme Court so far. It appears that the Supreme Court is going to rule that at least the Mississippi law that's before them should be upheld. And the question is, how far is the Supreme Court going to go? Are they going to overrule the two main abortion cases that kind of control everything, Roe versus Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood, a case out of Pennsylvania? When it initially came out, the majority opinion would not be assigned to someone to write unless that majority had made a decision. So we don't know how far that case decision will go. Will it go all the way to overturning Roe versus Wade? It will not. You've been told a big fat lie by a bunch of people that it will ban abortion all over the country. That's not what will happen. Now, I think a lot of us would love to see that. And there might be a constitutional basis for making that argument, but in the current legal environment, you're probably going to need a constitutional amendment to put that into place, to make it applicable all over the country. Otherwise, you're going to have a hodgepodge, piecemeal of some places that will allow abortion and some that won't. And everybody's weighing in. And here is this lady, Jen Hatmaker. I've referred to her in the past. She had a popular, I think, HGTV show or some home remodeling show. And then I guess she thought that that gave her authority to conduct Bible studies and teach and preach and that type of thing. And she was preaching at her church that she had with her husband before they got divorced. And she came out last year with, within the last couple of years, her daughter came out as homosexual. So she came out in support of homosexual rights and gay marriage and that type of thing. And so here she issues a blog post, My Thoughts on the Roe versus Wade Reversal, and she came out in support of abortion. So at some point, you know, we have to demand that people like this stop using the term evangelical when they describe themselves. And she's talking about how this will affect women, and I'm all for women, and this will, and she sounded like Janet Yellen. You remember the video clip I played of Janet Yellen, who goes to Congress and she's talking about the economic aspect. It'll be so hard on women and they'll be affected economically. But nobody ever considers the fact that since abortion was allowed in the United States, across the country by Roe versus Wade, we've had 75 million babies killed. And they're babies. They're babies with separate DNA that will live outside the womb. And that would have make a big difference in our economy if we had that many people that were around working. So I don't want to hear these ridiculous arguments. Now, this is an interesting article from the Times of London, and it talks about extremism pushes the U.S. towards dystopia. And what this is based on, and here's a sort of related article, racist replacement theory has to be quashed. So these things happen so quickly now. When was the Buffalo shooting? About a week ago? Okay, so about a week ago, a crazy, deranged, psychotic, sociopathic individual goes into a Buffalo supermarket in a black neighborhood, and he starts shooting people. And he was clearly a racist and that type of thing. And he had a 180-page manifesto. And of course, you can't get the manifesto and read it. Just like, remember the guy who went in and shot up, I think it was a mosque in New Zealand. He had a manifesto. Now, I was able to grab that. I think I might still have a copy somewhere. But immediately, the government didn't want you to read that. And so this one, I've not been able to find a copy of it. 180 pages, but what happened was immediately there was a parade of people, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, President Biden. I don't know if Kamala Harris talked about that or not. Kamala, whatever she calls herself from day to day. I don't know if she talked about it, but immediately they came out and said, well, this is a racist theory, because people like Tucker Carlson and conservatives, they believe that immigration is being done so minorities can replace whites as the majority in this country. And that may have already happened, honestly. But that's not what it is. In fact, the people who came up with the replacement theory were left-wing lunatics because they talked about this is how we're going to change America. Eventually, America will become the minority will become the majority, and you white people and your white privilege and everything will be out and nobody will care. And most of us don't. I have to be honest, I'm a conservative politically, as you may have gathered. It may have bled through. I try to mask it so hard. I try so hard to mask it. And I don't really care what race you are. I really don't. care more about your values and what your positions are. And I think that would be true of every other conservative that I know. But see, what they have to do is they have to demonize people. And immediately they have to demonize people with, oh, well, you believe in this racist thing and you want it. No, that's not true. I was at the ARC encounter a week and a half ago, with Bill Koenig, my good friend. And he was down in Cincinnati, so I went down and picked him up, and we went out to the ARC. And it was kind of interesting because Ken Ham, years ago, I heard him make a statement that the Bible is against interracial marriage. In the sense that, and he was making a joke, he's not doing it in terms of what you think. He's saying the unsaved race should not marry the saved race, okay? But he does another talk about one people, one race. And so I was just kind of joking. I went up to one of the guides, and Bill and I were talking and at the ARC, and I said, you know, I'm a direct descendant of Noah. And then she kind of said, think about it. And it's true, we were, you know, and we all are. And so the racial differences have happened, but that's not because we're not all humans. So and you see this, it's just been this litany of things, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, and everybody, they've come out with these huge articles saying, oh, you know, Tucker Carlson believes in the great replacement of one race with another. And that's not what he believes in. It's just a lie. But what is it? It's propaganda. It's misinformation. I'm just telling you that as we get closer to the midterm elections, the propaganda that you're going to see to demonize, particularly other parties, because right now the polling looks like Republicans should have a very good year. But the people on the other side that don't want that to happen, they are not going to go away quietly. And you're going to see a tremendous amount of information. Now, it's interesting that Caroline Glick, who I do respect quite a bit, and I would highly recommend that you read her columns. She wrote a column in Israel Hayom on Friday that was called Demonization American Style. I'll just read a little bit from that because I think it's very good thoughts. And she grew up in America. She was born in Chicago. Well, she grew up in Chicago. Demonization, the effort to portray a political rival as an inhuman monster, has long been a means to mobilize a public support. The ancient Romans did it. The Soviets didn't know there was another option. While negative campaigning has long been a tried and true method for winning elections in the free world, actual demonization was fairly rare, particularly in the United States. Actual demonization was a fairly rare phenomenon until after the turn of the century. But in recent decades, now when I grew up, the turn of the century meant 1899 to 1900. Now the turn of the century means something completely different. I ran into somebody the other night, and a young man, and we were started talking about basketball. And I said, I thought Larry Bird was the GOAT. He was the greatest of all time in many respects. And I had gone for a year to the same university that he played basketball at. And the guy goes, yeah, I read about him in a history book. I hear he was really good. He had been retired for a long time when I was born. Like, well, how old are you? Well, I was born in like 1998. Thanks. So when he thinks turn of the century, young whippersnapper, says, I hate it when people say things like I used to do when I was that age, but things have changed. So here's what she says about this use of this Buffalo shooting. Last Sunday, Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi showed how it is done in an interview with CNN. The interview focused on the Democrat Party's concern that the conservative majority in the Supreme Court will overturn Roe versus Wade, ending the federal mandate for abortions and letting the separate states decide for themselves whether to place limitations on the procedure. Concerns among Democrats and the party's progressive base rose exponentially earlier this month when, in a shocking break with the past, a source at the Supreme Court leaked a draft. Sunday, CNN's Dana Bash asked Pelosi if the fact that conservatives are now the majority on the Supreme Court means that the Democrats dropped the ball on abortion rights. Pelosi rejected that assertion and instead blamed Trump. Brimming with rage, Pelosi seethed, "Who would have ever suspected that a creature like Donald Trump would become president of the United States, waiving a list of judges that he would appoint, therefore getting the support of the far right and appointing those anti-just freedom justices to the Supreme Court?" In one sentence, Pelosi managed to demonize Trump voters, and delegitimize 3 sitting justices of the Supreme Court. It bears noting that Pelosi made these remarks. As she made these remarks, Democrat activists were staging threatening demonstrations outside the homes of conservative justices. And this is the way that it's going. She concludes with this: "It's hard to know what these former Republican conservatives tell themselves when they see empty shelves in supermarkets, $4 a gallon gas." But that's old news. She wrote this on Friday. That's almost gone away. Cratering stock markets and boys being persecuted for being boys in schools across America. It's hard to know what they tell themselves when they see children indoctrinated to reject their biological sex and hate their parents and their country. But what is clear enough is that through their efforts to demonize their fellow conservatives, former party and former president, these Trump-hating former Republicans, and she's talking about people like David French, or some of the people at National Review, or Bill Kristol. You put up this facade that they were conservatives. Liz Cheney, that would be another one. That these Trump-hating former Republicans enabled the progressive revolution. And she is right, it is a revolution. Under the mask of anti-Trump paranoia, this revolution rejects the foundations of the United States and seeks to transform the country from the land of the free and home of the brave into the land of the unfree and home of the bullied, cowed, and socially engineered. Great article. And so what you saw President Biden go to Buffalo this week and speak, it was the most atrocious, hateful presidential speech I've ever seen. And I watched most of Obama's speeches, so that's saying a lot. And we have a problem. We have a lot of other problems. So this is just some of the. This is from a week ago, and my screenshot is from a week ago. Near about 2 miles from my house, there's an interstate interchange, and diesel was $5.61. Now, diesel supplies. The United States has long operated on a sort of a just-in-time, light inventory type of model. And it's worked. I mean, it's efficient, it's economically, it increases profits and that type of thing. You don't have to store everything. And that's good when everything is flowing the right way. But when things start to break down and not flow the right way, now you have a huge problem. So I don't know the exact statistic, but I've heard that grocery stores have like 3 to 7 days of supplies on their shelves so that they will turn over. Now, you can always tell, because sometimes you pick up something at the grocery store and it's got dust on it because it's been there for a while. But as a general rule, in a week to 14 days, probably, the inventory should turn over in a grocery store, which means they will replace it with the stuff that's being shipped in. And we have a big Kroger warehouse near us, and trucks are going in and out of there all the time. I mean, just a line of trucks. But what happens when they can't get the goods, then everything starts to break down and it starts to cascade through the system. And one commentator I heard the other day say, we're seeing the beginning of the breakdown of a complex system. And it's not going to be pretty. And I don't know the change. And I don't know if it's going to change in the near future. One of the issues is diesel fuel. So diesel fuel usually has about a 20-day supply at refineries and that sort of thing. The United States has lost about half of its refineries over the past 20 years. Now, they've increased capacity at some of the other refineries, but there was a major refinery on the East Coast in Philadelphia, and I heard somebody talking about the other day, said they went by where this refinery was, there was an explosion, and they're tearing it apart. But there's no plans to build another one. And so they try to manage the inventory. So, okay, we're going to refine oil to make diesel, and then we're going to do this here. Well, now diesel is down from what used to be a 19 or 20-day supply, and particularly in the Northeast, it's down to about a 3-day supply. That's troubling because everything in terms of getting goods to market and food and goods shipped around pretty much relies on diesel. Trucks run on diesel, railroad cars run on diesel, big container ships on the ocean run on diesel. They're not sailboats out there, they're diesel-run ships. And when this starts to break down, it's going to be a problem. Prices have gone up. Some places they're $7 a gallon or more. Truckers, some truckers they've stopped driving because they can't get the contracts that will pay them enough money on a per mile basis to make any money. They lose money by driving, so why bother? A lot of them are selling their rigs. So it just leads to this cascade of things that are happening. It also has a big impact on farming because tractors run on diesel. And you see the big tractors they have now. I was listening to a farmer on an interview yesterday. He and his family own 3,000 acres down in Florida. They've decided because the price of diesel and fertilizer and that type of thing, they're only going to plant 1,000 acres this year because the price of their fertilizer is up 350% compared to last year. So they either plant without fertilizer, but a lot of the seeds are really tied to being fertilized to unlock their potential. I heard another interview with a guy who had met with Ohio farmers who said they're going to plant without fertilizer this year, or they're not going to plant. The farmer in Florida said it, or I guess it was an Ohio farmer, said he went down to fill up his tractor with diesel and it stopped filling at $850 because it hit his credit card limit for that transaction. So he had to get another credit card to finish out the transaction. And I'm watching people in big SUVs that, when I fill up for gas and they're, I'm seeing $125, $150 gasoline charges. I've never seen that before in my life. So you have this, everything is just breaking down in the system. It's also causing, this is another thing that's happening. Well, we've heard about formula shortages. And I was asking questions last night about, did we have formula when I was a kid? I guess we did. I don't know. I don't remember how I got fed the first few years. Obviously, I did. You can look at me and see that. But so there was a problem at a Abbott plant up in Michigan that makes about 40% of, depending on how you categorize the formula. They had a problem. They thought it was a bacteria issue. They shut the plant down. They did a bunch of testing and analysis, and they found that it really wasn't the plant, but before the plant can come back on, it has to be inspected by the Food and Drug Administration, which only has like 8 or 9 inspectors of that type. And so they've been sitting there since at least February or late January trying to get the plant back online. And they say when we get the plant back up and running, in a few months we can get everything caught up. That's because there's just not a bunch of formulas stored someplace. And so everything is breaking down. There's power problems. There are power grid warnings being issued by utilities all over the country because there's not capacity in the system for a bad heat wave. Now that's coupled with some other problems. For example, here's a historic drought. This is a picture of Lake Mead in near Las Vegas. And so I'll just read this. Human skeletal remains were recovered from Lake Mead this week as the country's largest reservoir receded to historically low levels and severe drought conditions and rising temperatures. Days earlier, boaters had found a barrel buried in mud that contained a corpse, likely from a 1980s gunshot victim, said police. Lake Mead is part of the Colorado River Basin, which provides water to more than 40 million people across 7 western states and parts of Mexico. The reservoir is at about 30% capacity, while Lake Powell, which also fills from the same Colorado River, is at 24% capacity. California's 2 largest reservoirs, Shasta Lake and Lake Oroville, are at critically low levels just as the state enters its dry season. California depends on heavy rainfall in March, but the state got just 1 inch of precipitation that month, as temperatures were 3 degrees warmer than usual. Water use, meanwhile, jumped dramatically in March as homeowners responded to the drought by watering their lawns earlier than usual, using the most water for the month since 2015. Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti asked residents and businesses to cut landscape watering from 3 days per week to 2. The state relies on melted snow from the Sierra Nevada mountains, but snowpack this year was at just 27% of the historic average. Statewide, 20% of wells are reporting all-time low water levels. Government officials expect 350,000 acres of Sacramento Valley farmland to lay fallow this year. But that Central Valley area is where we get about 40% of our fruits and vegetables. And then you have the shipping problem, because now the trucks aren't running because there's not diesel and lack of drivers. And you see how all of this cascades together. So The Economist this week, and I don't agree with The Economist. I've shown you The Economist, but they do like a predictive issue each year, what they think is going to happen. And remarkably, there's a lot of things that seem to come about. So they'll do like the world in 2017, 2018, 2020, 2021. You know, they do that issue each year. And sometimes they're kind of, you have to kind of really work to figure them out, what they're trying to say. And one year, a few years ago, they actually used the 4 horsemen because they were predicting shortages and things that we see in the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I just read you in Revelation 17. So their current issue is called the coming food catastrophe. Now that was picked up on by Guterres, Secretary General Guterres of the UN, at a meeting this week in New York where he said this.
When war is waged, people go hungry. We are on the brink of a perfect storm that threatens to devastate people and economies.
Well, I guess I thought I had more of a clip than that, but I guess not. Well, good, because we don't like to listen to him that much anyway. By the way, just so you know, I'm going to talk about the World Health Organization is having a big meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, starting today. And there's some very serious implications about what they're doing, I think. A lot of other people think. Of course, it's all fake news if they don't agree with you. You're just this radical, crazy, loony conspiracy theorist, conservative, and you just, and so, listen, what's one person say? There are no conspiracies. There are no conspiracies, but there are no coincidences either. And so if you don't want people to believe in conspiracy theory, then stop making them all come true. That's, I guess, the simple way to do that. So Gutierrez did that. So you have this article from the Economist, but it looks like grain shock wheat, stalks of wheat. But when you zoom in, look at what the kernels of the wheat are made to look like. Now, I showed this to a bunch of people. I posted on my Facebook page, and they're like, that's creepy. That is creeping me out. But this is what, The Economist is an important magazine. It is what people are thinking about and what they're seeing, that this is a coming food catastrophe. So let me just read for you a little bit from this article. Give me a second here. So, war, extreme weather, and export controls are all contributing to a world grain shortage. That's one article. It just says that it talks about all these people, and it's like, the war in Ukraine, those are Russia and Ukraine are two of the most important wheat-growing regions in the world. By the way, do you know what the second largest wheat-growing country in the world is? India. I didn't know that. India this week stopped exporting wheat because they were afraid that they're going to have shortages because they've had extremely hot weather, which is affecting the wheat. Here in our winter wheat, the miracle that it grows in the winter, but down in Texas, they had a crop that was like the worst they ever had, and it's one of the most important of the components of the wheat crop. And what happens too, if you're not fertilizing wheat, you get a less quality of wheat, which means they can use it for less things. If you want to, the definition of a vicious cycle is look at the world today, because we are in a number of these vicious cycles. By invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin will destroy the lives of people far from the battlefield. And on a scale even he may soon regret. The war is battering a global food system weakened by COVID-19, climate change, and energy shock. Ukraine's exports of grain and oilseeds have mostly stopped, and Russia's are threatened. Together, the two countries supply 12% of the traded calories of the world. The world doesn't have the capacity to make that up in the short term. Now, usually what would happen is if there was a drought in Ukraine, there might be some bumps for a year or so. Like back in 2010, Ukraine had a drought and their wheat production fell, and the world was able to ramp up production in other places to cover that over after a year. But what happened? Arab Spring, because of food shortages, wheat shortages in Syria, which itself was going through a multi-year drought in their food-growing region. So again, it's sort of a miracle that the system works at all. But when it starts to unwind and break down, it's breaking down in many different ways. So you just can't say, okay, California grow more wheat. Okay, yeah, well, wait a minute, we don't have any water, and we can't get fertilizer from Ukraine, and we can't even get it delivered to the farm because of the diesel, and then we can't afford to put the diesel in the tractor. You see how all this thing cascades. Now, places like the United States, which has pretty good agricultural abundance might not be as bad as other places, but it's going to be bad everywhere. I just don't see how and I hope I'm wrong. Nearly 250 million people in the world are on the brink of famine. If the war drags on in Ukraine and supplies from Russia and Ukraine are limited, hundreds of millions more people could fall into poverty. Political unrest will spread, children will be stunted, and people will starve. And so now what we have is a big problem. Russia and Ukraine supply 28% of the globally traded wheat, 29% of the barley, 15% of the maize, and 75% of the sunflower oil. Russia and Ukraine contribute about half the cereals imported by Lebanon and Tunisia. For Libya and Ukraine, the figure is 2/3. Ukraine's food experts provide the calories to feed 400 million people. In fact, I read an article, I think it was from the Atlantic Council, that analyzes these things, and said that properly managed, Ukraine could likely feed the world. They have some of the richest topsoil, and it's like 8 feet thick in a lot of places. And so it's an incredibly rich agricultural region. But I'm reading they've tried to plant, but there's mines in the fields that the Russians and the Ukrainians have put there, and it just doesn't work. So you have extreme temperatures in India. And what happens too when food prices go up, people can't afford it because in a lot of places they already spend 25% of their family's budget on food. So this is just a problem. So here's India. They're saying they're banning wheat exports. Sri Lanka is in the middle of a meltdown. It's leading to kind of some strange bedfellows. Well, they're kind of ideologically the same, but Iran and Cuba now are doing a bartering trade for wheat because Cuba can grow wheat, but they need oil. So Iran's going to send oil there in exchange for wheat. And I think I have a slide later. There are food riots going on right now in Iran because what they did last week was they cut the food subsidies that they used to subsidize the cost of food, and they just stopped them. And so what happened was cooking oil, wheat, flour, bread went up, in some cases, 400% in a week. And people get a little bit kind of gnarly and angry when they're hungry. It's bad. This is Financial Times. Wall Street went into a bear market. Global economy, today's Washington Post, on an edge of a knife. Here's an article from Bloomberg. Age of scarcity begins with a $1.6 trillion hit to the world economy. The ties that bind the global economy together and deliver goods in abundance across the world are unraveling at a frightening pace. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, China's COVID-0 lockdowns are disrupting supply chains, hammering growth, and pushing inflation to 40-year highs. They're the chief reason why Bloomberg Economics has lopped $1.6 trillion off its forecast for global GDP in 2022. The United States GDP is about 22 trillion. But what if that's just the initial hit? War and plague don't last forever, but the underlying problem, a world increasingly divided upon geopolitical fault lines, only looks set to get worse. And it's going to stay. You saw cases this week where Target, their stock dropped 25% in an hour. Walmart dropped 15% over 2 days. Walmart executives are saying, hey, we got a problem. We're not selling gallons of milk anymore. People are buying half gallons. Why? Well, because they can afford a certain amount and the price has gone up, they'll buy a half gallon. But then that leads to nutrition issues. So you see, it's just it is a vicious cycle. For the decades, a defining feature of the world economy is its been ability to churn out ever more goods at ever lower prices. The entry of more than 1 billion workers from China and the former Soviet bloc into the global labor market, coupled with falling trade barriers and hyper-efficient logistics, produced an age of abundance, but that is over. And so what Bloomberg article is saying is this is now the new age of scarcity. All of this risks leaving advanced economies facing a problem they thought they'd vanished long ago, that of scarcity. Emerging nations could see more acute threats to energy and food security like the ones already causing turmoil in countries from Sri Lanka to Peru and now Iran. And everyone will have to grapple with higher prices. Here's an interview on Pandemic War Room with Ed Dowd, who is a former BlackRock financial analyst. And I think you need to listen to it. I mean, I want to give you good news. But, you know, we see all these things happening. And I don't want to be the guy to stand up here and say, well, it's not really happening. Okay, it really is happening. And it sounds a lot like Revelation. Now, are we there yet or not? That's up for argument. But when do you distinguish this? How do you distinguish it now from what it talks about in Revelation? And you can say, well, the Antichrist isn't here yet, or I'm still here. Okay, well, we'll see. So here's Steve Bannon and Ed Dowd on Pandemic War Room, I think on Friday.
Let's go to Ed Dowd. I want to thank Ed for getting up so early. Ed's formerly with BlackRock, a portfolio manager, absolutely brilliant guy. He's been on talking about the death rates and everything. But I wanted to get him on. Give me your sense of the overall economy, because I'm making the theory of my case is you're seeing the beginning of a complex system collapse. Ed Dowd, what are your macro thoughts about where we stand in the United States economy and the global economy?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Steve. If you remember, I came on in February and talked about the global economy and the end of the monetary system as we know it. Global debt is starting to collapse. And I said credit markets and equity markets would be unhinged, and that's what we've seen. More importantly, it's going to continue, and it's going to start to accelerate. Bottom line is the Fed is trapped. There's some indicators that I follow with some other people that suggest that the rate hike cycle was over before it started. So they're tightening into a disaster. They should be actually loosening credit conditions, pumping money into the system, believe it or not. So they're no. Whoa. Isn't that just going to prolong? I mean, that's just, I got it. So, but isn't that's just giving you more heroin? That's because the junkie's starting to sweat. You're going to hit him up with more heroin? Is Ed Dowd? You're so weak. This is a flag. No, tell me why. Tell me why. So, it's a solution. Dad, tell me why. Well, I'll tell you why. So bottom line is credit conditions, and Goldman Sachs Financial Credit Conditions Index has tightened 200 basis points since the beginning of the year. Each 100 basis point tightening represents minus 2% off GDP 4 quarters out. So we're going into recession. We're going to go in hard. The other thing you need to understand is the advance in the CRB has been 211%. That's the largest CRB advance in a commodity cycle. We're in a commodity cycle.
Tell people what a commodity cycle is and tell what CRB is.
CRB is the commodities index that basically tracks a basket of commodities. Oil is a big part of it. If you look at the commodity cycles in the chart up here, this has been the single largest advance, and the cycle's not over yet. The top's ahead of us. And what's important to realize about this cycle that's different from others, this is the first time the US dollar has risen concurrently about 18% in the last year. Super fast rise in the dollar. So it's the rate of change in both the CRB and the dollar. And what that indicates to me is that this is not wholly a monetary phenomenon. It's mostly an energy policy phenomenon from the Biden administration, the EU, and then you throw in the lockdowns in China. So it's a supply chain issue. It's an energy policy issue. It's this ESG nonsense. So the Fed is tightening into bad policy at the same time, and I think we're going to see an absolute collapse of credit and the economy. Now, one other thing to note is the
Ho. Hang on. Whoa. We can't drop a bomb like that and just skip past it. When you say, when you say economy, right now, you're saying this is not going to be a soft landing, and that means the
No.
recession is going to be
very hard.
So you think it's going to be very hard. I tell you what, hold that, because I want to walk people through it. It's very important. And I realize for the audience out there, a lot of times you don't get this kind of capital markets economic.
Well, you can find that on Rumble at War Room, Pandemic War Room podcast. I'll spare you the bad news, okay? I'll have a show an act of mercy, but it's fairly dire. And so what the Economist shows on its cover, whether it's reporting or predictive, and the graphic image that they used is meant to convey a very serious message to people. It's not done to be humorous. I was talking to someone involved in banking yesterday and said that one bank that he is aware of, that they are seeking 15 to 20 portfolio managers immediately. And what does that mean? Well, they've kicked the can down the road. Now they're going to have to make some decisions. Are we going to continue this loan? Are we going to work it out? We're going to foreclose on it. And you're going to see a wave there that's going to have an impact like 2008 did. And we live in Ohio. Cleveland was horrible in the housing and other panics of 2008. They hired 14 magistrates in Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, just to handle the foreclosures. I suspect that something similar to that is coming. They've been kicking the can down the road during this COVID thing for a couple years. And the interesting thing is, so here's Financial Times, is the world heading for a recession? And let's hope it's only a recession. Let's hope it's not stagflation, which is worse. Biden's now less popular than Jimmy Carter. Remember 18.5% mortgage rates? Now, some people benefited from that. Hey, I'm getting 21% on my certificate of deposit. It's a different world than any of us have ever lived in. Here's the so-called conservative, I'll use that in scare quotes, Scotty Morrison down in Australia was voted out. Looks like the left-wing Labour Party is going to take control. And people were complaining about what was going on. Well, some people were complaining about what was going on with regard to the Charlie Vector restrictions down in Australia. So what did they do when they had an opportunity to vote? Give me more. Bring it on. I haven't had enough of that loving that you guys give to us, taking away our freedom. This is I think the picture that I might have skipped over. You know what this is? That's a busy highway interchange in Shanghai. That's usually packed bumper to bumper with cars. What is there, one car there? Two? Oh, okay. So, man, there's two there, okay. Probably each doing 98 too, but if it's like, have you noticed fast driving on the freeways around here? So that's the recession. So is that the black horse of Revelation or the pale horse? I don't know. I don't think so, but it's certainly a big, heavy preview of it. So I'm going to spend a little time with this. I'm going to try to do a little bit on the Middle East. I can see that I'm way behind in the time that I wanted to spend, but it is what it is. So the World Health Organization, I love this graphic that I saw. I forget where I saw that. So what they're doing is they've proposed an international treaty on pandemics because the last one went And I don't know that they need the treaty. They certainly did a lot of the things. You know, they adopted the China model of lockdowns and that sort of thing. And so now they want to do a pandemic treaty to make it incumbent on everybody. And so this is the EU has put together a nice little infographic about we need to be better prepared for the next pandemic because there's a next pandemic coming, don't you know? I'm not sure what it is. It might even be Charlie Vector coming back. And they're predicting a bad fall for Charlie Vector, by the way. And it just seems to coincide with the United States midterm elections. And they're talking a lot of mail-in voting or lockdowns. And I think if you don't have a certain treatment for Charlie Vector 019er, you're probably not going to be allowed to vote. That's my guess, the way this is going. And I've said that to a couple of people, and people look at me like, you're out of your mind. That's unconstitutional. They don't care about the Constitution anymore. Come on. Get over it. Show me where they care about it at all. So there's, pandemic prevention and response requires a global approach so that the next time a pandemic strikes, the world is better prepared. And they have all kinds of praise for that leftist Marxist Tedros guy that heads it up. Why an international agreement? It will ensure, sustain, and long-term political commitment, define clear processes and tasks, ensure long-term public and private sector support, foster an all-of-government and all-of-society approach, integrating health matters across all relevant policy areas, research, innovation, financing, transport. But to me, what that sounds like? We're gonna run it all, and we're gonna decide at the WHO level. Talked a little bit about this. So here's a report that came out in early May from the World Health Organization, zero draft report of the Working Group on Strengthening WHO Preparedness in Response to Health Emergencies to the 75th World Health Assembly, which starts today in Geneva, Switzerland. And so here some of the provisions in this, excuse me one second, for some reason this one got out of sequence. So the zero draft, it's called Working Group Preparedness and Response. So up in the right-hand corner, you see A/WGPR, that's Working Group Preparedness Response. And so this is their official document. And so they have different things that they break it down. So one of the things they talk about there is global surveillance. The working group expressed strong interest in the application of a One Health approach. Sounds kind of like a One World approach, doesn't it? That would yield significant benefits for the international community to reduce the risk posed by emerging diseases. The One Health concept. This could provide new and or strengthening of existing platform surveillance, further multi-sectorial partnerships. This sounds like the China model. And then they go on, there's a section where they talk about strengthening the international health regulations. They refer to those as IHR. Recognizing the need for national and global coordinated actions to address the misinformation, disinformation, stigmatization that undermine public health. That sounds like right out of the Department of Homeland Security's misinformation playbook that we've been dealing with. You see how all this seems to be coordinated. So here, WHO's Secretariat, World Health Organization Secretariat, to build capacity to deploy proactive countermeasures against misinformation and social media attacks. That sounds like they're interested in having a discussion on the topic, right? Maybe not. Proactive countermeasures. And then here's another one, the Secretary to discuss on the use of alternative acronym for public health emergency of international concern. So now, right now, they want to call it PHEMIC. You see how detailed they are in this? So they call it a public health emergency of international concern, PHEMIC. Beforehand, they were just calling a public health emergency of international concern, and the problem was people were pronouncing that fake. So they don't like that, so they're going to redo the acronym. So, you know, we don't have to deal with misinformation, disinformation. Here's another sector, travel measures. They want to have additional health measures that restrict international travel. A digital version of the international certificate of vaccination and prophylaxis. So this is where they're going. Development of digital technologies for contact tracing in the international context, as well as options for the digitalization of all health forms. This is out of sequence. So while you're chewing on that, this is from I think a Philadelphia school. Philadelphia Trans Wellness Conference, a program of the Mazzoni Center. So they're funding this in our schools. This is what Christopher Rufer says. He's talking about the trans ideology movement. And this is being done in schools where they're having kids come and talking to them about these subjects. Now, I'll do that another time. That's neither here nor there. Now, this was breaking news. Somebody texted this to me just as I was walking up here. Breaking news. Belgium becomes the first country to introduce mandatory 21 days quarantine for the people who test positive for the monkeypox. Have you heard about the monkeypox? It's the latest pandemic. Now, we know that with regard to this particular pandemic, there wasn't a thing, and this is another conspiracy theory charge. There was a thing that happened a couple months just before they did it. It was Johns Hopkins, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, Department of Homeland Security, did a big conference called Event 201. And they talked about, okay, if there is a coronavirus, a Charlie vector pandemic, how are we going to respond to it? And if you go through and you watch those sessions, they're still available online, Event 201, and go to session 4, and it will show you a lot of what we've seen about how they want to control and get rid of disinformation, misinformation, and shut people down. And boy, have they ever. What's interesting, though, if you dig into their website, you'll see there was a thing called the Atlantic Storm, which was like a series of terror attacks. And this was all done through the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Policy or Center for Security that they have there. And they have these, they call them desktop exercises. They get a group of people together and they talk through how they're going to handle these crisis situations. So one of them related to an expected, what would happen if we had a Charlie vector outbreak. Back in 2004, they did, it was a series of terrorist attacks involving pathogens and toxic materials. And 2018, they had one. The year before, Event 201, they had one called Clade 18, which related to another medical emergency. And so they've done a series of these. And you can find the videos and everything. Go to the Johns Hopkins website. Well, if you dig around there, you'll find that they did one in November or last year. And it was called Strengthening Global Systems to Prevent and Respond to High Consequence Biological Threats. The 2021 tabletop exercise conducted in partnership with the Munich Security Conference. And this is a picture of the PDF there, that the publication. And look at some of these things that they have here. So they did a scenario where this outbreak of this pathogen resulted in 3 billion cases worldwide and 270 million deaths. So this is just a few months ago, 6 months ago, they had this exercise. And again, done by all the same people that did the ones before. So you can read through the executive summary if you want. This exercise portrayed a deadly global pandemic involving an unusual strain of monkeypox virus. Boy, they're good. that emerged in the fictional nation of Britannia and spread globally over 18 months. Ultimately, the exercise scenario revealed that the initial outbreak was caused by a terrorist attack using a pathogen engineered in a laboratory. I didn't think we were allowed to talk about that. With the inadequate biosafety and biosecurity provisions and weak oversight. I didn't think we were allowed to talk about that either. But it's okay when Johns Hopkins do it. So let's support the work of Johns Hopkins, and then we can talk about it too, right? Maybe. By the end of the exercise, the fictional pandemic resulted in more than 3 billion cases and 270 million fatalities globally, worldwide. And so they came up with a series of things. What do we have to do? Well, interesting that this comes out, and then right after it comes out, the World Health Organization wants to redo their global treaty. And so here's one of the recommendations: bolster international systems for pandemic risk assessment, warning and investigating outbreak origins. Bullet point number 1, the WHO should develop a graded, transparent international public health alert system. And when you read through what they're trying to do and the amendments that the United States has proposed, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to amend a treaty, and a treaty is supreme law of the land as the Constitution, under our Constitution. The UN should establish a new mechanism for investigating high consequence biological events of unknown origin, which we refer to as a joint assessment mechanism. You can find more of that on page 22. But here's the interesting thing. So when they were doing their fictional scenario about the outbreak of the monkey thing, they said, well, in our scenario, it starts, and here's a picture of the graphic, and it says here, the attack happens on May 15th, 2022. So that was last Sunday. So what happened this week? Well, we have all this stuff in the press, and now Belgium has put in place 21-day quarantine for people who come down with monkeypox. That's just kind of there are no conspiracies, but there are no coincidences. Here it is. Attack May 15th, 2022. 1,400 cases, 4 deaths. Go look at the news reports about it and see how many cases there are and how many deaths there have been. And it's in the United States now. Now, I don't think it's as serious as anybody that they're making it out to be, but understand that this is it's here, and so the question is: are they going to use this? How are they going to use this? And in Geneva today, do you think that this subject has come up and said, "Hey, maybe we can use this current outbreak to ramp up the powers that we have as the World Health Organization"? It just seems to be kind of interesting timing on all of this. And I don't know where this thing came from, but there are people that are sick. I think there are even some people that have died, but it does require pretty close contact. And the United States has ordered 19 million vaccine doses to help take care of it. That'll be delivered over the next 18 months or so. So I don't know if they're expecting a huge outbreak, but the question is, what do they do with it in terms of what they take away from us in the midst of all this other stuff that I've just spent an hour telling you about? And so we talked about this last week, the Digital Service Act in the EU, and they're putting together how they're going to protect people. And some of the things they want to do is they want to protect people against that are online, and they want to protect them against what? Illegal products, hate speech, and what? Disinformation. You'll see that all over the place. So they have the international health regulations, and this is from this is by their own. This is from our CDC talking about the World Health Organization. It says it's a legally binding agreement, and they want to amend it. And again, we have all this stuff at the same time that's coming about misinformation, disinformation, and that type of thing. And if you go, by the way, when you dig into this stuff, it says, well, why don't you go here to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and you can find out what is MDM. Well, they tell you what MDM is based on what the Department of Homeland Security has told us in that directive issued on February 7th, 2022, misinformation, malinformation, and misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. They even have some pretty slick graphic novels that you can get, Real Fake and Bug Bites, that tell you how to do it. There's like a thing for election security officials, like a misinformation tool. By the way, our friend Nina Jankowicz, also known as Scary Poppins, who does those show tune videos, and she resigned this week. So there is good news. They said they've put the Disinformation Governance Board on the DGB on hiatus. Do you think it's really going away? They got caught, so now it'll be harder to find the next time. And there's a picture of her, by the way, in 2019. Now, I said she's either doing work for somebody or she's hacking a slot machine somewhere. It just so happens, though, this lady's been involved in all kinds of things. There's a thing called the Integrity Awareness Project or something like that, which is a bunch of news people that got together to try to control narratives and misinformation, disinformation. She was part of it. Documents were released this week. She was in one of the working groups on that. And these were reporters at New York Times and Washington Post and stuff. And she's on, when she resigned, she's immediately going around and everybody's doing the sympathy interviews and, oh, it was just so terrible. And I'm a woman and you can't see, but I'm 38 weeks pregnant and that they would do this to me when I'm in this condition. And by the way, she never mentioned that she was worried about getting formula. It's kind of interesting. But guess where she is when this picture is taken back in 2019? So here's Taylor Loren's article the other day in the Washington Post saying, oh, right-wing attacks derail administration's effort to counter disinformation. And if you read the article, essentially what Taylor Lorenz herself is a lunatic, I don't know how else to describe it. She says disinformation shut down the Disinformation Board. But you can watch videos of her. By the way, who's she working for here in this picture? Caption up there says, this picture is taken in 2019 while she was working on the campaign for a guy named Zelensky in Ukraine. No conspiracies, but no coincidences. So she's all over now, oh, how terrible this was. And I just want to stand for the truth. She's a propagandist. So I'm not going to do too much. The war in Ukraine is dragging on, and it's probably going to drag on for a while. Russia's rolled out this thing with its, this is related to S-300s, and I'll talk about that in Syria. I will get that covered before we get out of here today. Here's another, this is from the Times of London, which I think they do a couple 2-page spreads every day in the paper about the Ukrainian war. Russian blockade of grain exports fuels famine fears. And that's true. And Russia's there, things aren't going as well for Russia, I think, as they planned. Finland and Sweden have applied for entry into NATO. And so this is a good editorial in the Financial Times the other day. Russia learns the hard way about the folly of war. It's not going well. There are some estimates. I don't know nobody knows exactly what the truth is. But the UK government has estimated that 1/3 of the Russian troops involved in the invasion have been killed. Or disabled. It just didn't go well. So now Finland and Sweden, who'd never wanted to be part of NATO, are now applying to be part of NATO because they're concerned about Russia moving on Finland, and Finland shares a border with Russia. It used to be part of it. In fact, I think the person who designed and laid out St. Petersburg in Russia is the same one who laid out Helsinki in Finland. So there's a lot of similarities there. They haven't asked for Russia back or for Alaska back yet, but who knows. But now Turkey's come out. Turkey has veto power. All the NATO members have to agree if a new person's going to join NATO. And Turkey says, I don't want Sweden and Finland in here. And it's kind of an interesting thing, but Sweden and Finland fund opposition groups in the Kurdish regions of Turkey that Erdogan considers to be terrorist groups. So he's saying, not going to do it, not going to do it. Russia's cut off gas to some places, Finland, Netherlands. I mean, it's just, everything is, someday somebody will write let's assume all this goes away and we're around here for a long time. Somebody will write a novel about all the stuff that's going on right now. And, the Orwellian stuff that's going on at the government level, and they won't be able to get it published because everybody would say, that's not, your novel, even though it's fiction, has to be somewhat plausible. Let alone, we haven't even talked about, and I'm not going to talk about the UF disclosure meetings that they're having at the US Congress this week for the first time in decades. And you sit there some days and you say, I believe all this stuff in the Bible, but what's going on? So what's happened is Russia used to have, the NATO borders used to be pretty far away from Russia. And then, they've changed over time. And now they're going to move closer. And if if Ukraine, Belarus is really Russian. So what you're going to have is you're going to have the borders of NATO right on Russia's borders, as opposed to a little bit away, maybe a couple hundred miles of the Finland border and everything. So now, remember when we showed this map originally of what's going on in Ukraine, that there was a lot of red all around Ukraine. Now they've pulled back to certain areas. Now they've shut off, they've got a blockade of the Black Sea, and that's not good. So let me, there's a lot going on right now with regard to the Temple Mount. And there's a Rom party, it's an Arab party, it's a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated party that's now part of the ruling coalition in Israel. And Abbas, the head of that party, not Mahmoud, not this guy, Abu Mazen, but another Abbas. And Ram has made some demands on the Temple Mount. And essentially they say, let Jordan run everything. Well, they say that that's the status quo, but that's not the status quo because Jordan doesn't really run everything. But they want to shut down non-Muslims of all stripes from going up on the Temple Mount. Particularly Jews, though. So there's this push going on, and it's interesting. This site is where God chose to have his house built. This is a holy place to God. It's not so much the temple, it's the place where this happened. And we know that with regard to this place, there will be sacrifices started again and that type of thing. Now, there's a lot of things going on. Is the temple being built? There was some reports this week that they're actually hewing the stones that they're going to use to build the third temple. And there's a lot of talk about the third temple in the press. In fact, there's a website, I'd never seen it before. It's called thirdtemple.org. And here's what it says. Let's build the third temple together. Now, I don't know how long this has been around. I showed you that guy who envisioned sort of a house of all faiths up there. And somebody said, well, what would they do about the sacrifices? Well, the sacrifices were not, other than the Day of Atonement, the altar was outside of the temple in the holy place. So that could be reinstated without the temple or with a ecumenical temple on the back side. And this is their purpose, to peacefully build the third temple of Jerusalem on the Temple Mount. This temple will be a building to God, that God would want to disclose his presence before everyone on earth. So you can kind of see even here in the thirdtemple.org is this ecumenical language that's being used. The addition of these elements will result in a solution to all conflicts and subsequently bring about world peace. Without this divine presence, unfortunately, we cannot achieve this. And they have schematics and drawings there and a pretty good graphic of the Temple Mount. So this is all ramping up. You know, you had this convergence of Ramadan, resurrection, and Passover all converging at the same time this year. And you've had a lot of disputes about the Temple Mount. And there's a lot going on. I'll have to clear up some of this in a midweek update. Let me just give you a couple headlights. So here's Nasrallah, and he was doing a speech the other day. I'm trying to remember, May 9th, 2022. He said, if we make a clear and serious threat, no international firm will drill in Israel's Karish gas field. If Israel presents Lebanon's offshore drilling, we will answer in kind. And so here's a schematic drawing. There's these oil fields in the Levant Basin, and there's a dispute as to those dark areas there off the coast of Israel and Lebanon. Who does it belong to? And so Israel and the Lebanese government have been going back and forth. By the way, that process has been mediated by a guy named Amos Hochstein from the U.S. State Department, who was involved in amazingly, you might be surprised, he was involved in the Obama State Department. Isn't that interesting? They just don't seem to ever go away, and they're recycled. So those black areas are gas and oil deposits. So there's talk about this. And Lebanon had elections this week. Hezbollah, which has essentially ruled Lebanon for a while, lost a number of people out of their ruling coalition. And so there's been some cutback in Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon. But what does that mean? I mean, does that mean they're not out? They're still there. But does that mean that Lebanon might be in a position in the future they'll reduce Hezbollah's influence a little bit more, and they might be able to become part of the Abraham Accords, which I think would be incredibly significant prophetically. And, you know, we have the Saudi Arabia thing. Biden's kind of cozying up to Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He may want to become part of the Abraham Accords. The IDF also announced this week that the son-in-law of Soleimani, Qassam Soleimani, has been smuggling arms to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So there are, you know, all these different meetings going on. Here's the president of Shiite Iran meeting with the emir, the sheikh in charge of Sunni Qatar, which is a big funder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they had a meeting in Tehran this week. I showed you pictures, I think, of Assad meeting in Tehran for the second time in the last over decade, only the second time. Assad was there to meet with Khamenei and Raisi and the foreign minister and everybody, because those are Assad's buddies from Syria. There was one incident, kind of significant. Now, Turkey steps in, they always step in. So we don't want you to build illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank. And Turkey's trying to get their own influence there and come to the fore. But the sheikh, the president of the United Arab Emirates, died a week ago, Friday or Saturday. He'd not been effectively running the country for some time. His brother, who's known as MBC, Mohammed bin Zayed, has been ruling, and he was elected the president. But then everybody and their brothers going to the United Arab Emirates, and the United Arab Emirates is behind a lot of this stuff, like on the digital passports and that type of thing, they're funding it. They've built, big buildings. Here's some video of the funeral service for the sheikh that died. This was last Sunday. His name was Khalifa, Sheikh Khalifa. By the way, they renamed the big building in Dubai. He was from Abu Dhabi. There are like 7 little sheikdoms that make up the United Arab Emirates because they're very tribal. The guy there on the right in that one picture is the new president. We'll call him MBZ. So we have MBS, MBZ. But this building in Dubai, this is the tallest building on the planet, the Burj Khalifa building. It's like it's half a mile high. It's tall. It's like 1,000 feet taller than the Sears Tower in Chicago. It used to be the tallest building in the world. And so they named it after the guy because he gave $10 billion when Dubai was having some financial problems back in the 2008 crisis. He gave $10 billion. So when they built the building, they named it after him. And he was the president of the United Arab Emirates, but he wasn't the head of Dubai, the sheikh in charge of Dubai. He was the sheikh from Abu Dhabi, but they voted him president of the whole group. Thought our politics were complicated. So here's MBZ. And on the right is the sheikh in charge of Dubai. So the guy from Abu Dhabi is now the president. The guy on the right is still the sheikh in charge of Dubai in that big, beautiful, fancy city that they built. He's had some problems over the last year. He had to pay a $500 million plus settlement to his 6th wife. And as I've said, it's the 6th wife that always gets you. You can manage 5, but that 6th one, and she happens to be the half-sister of King Abdullah II of Jordan. She's Jordanian. Yeah, royals sort of interbreed. It's everywhere. They do it in the Middle East, they do it in Europe, and they do it in DC. Quick story, I had a big case and I had an expert witness in DC, and I'm sitting there talking to the guy and he goes, oh yeah, my ex-wife is head of that agency and my current wife is a partner in this big law firm, and I'm heading up the legal department at this agency, and I'll soon go to a big law firm. And I mentioned somebody, she goes, oh yeah, she's married to my wife's sister's brother. That's like, they're inbred in DC like European royalty. Maybe why we have stupid things coming out of there. Just a suggestion. So here's the new leader of United Arab Emirates. And he was a big proponent, he's been a big proponent of the Abraham Accords. So I think those will only be strengthened. Should also note at the same time that Jared Kushner has a thing called the Abraham Accords Peace Institute. And in their governing document, they said they wanted to raise money to invest in Israel, and they've now raised $3 billion, including $2 billion from Saudi Arabia, to invest in Israeli startup companies. That's just really unheard of. So let me just cover one more thing. So Iran's behind a lot of this. This is some graphics I pulled off from a talk, an interview that Nasrallah gave back in 2019, where he talked about he talked about a map, and we're going to go after Israel and that type of thing. And he also admitted in that speech or talk that, we're going after Israel. They'll run away. They'll be scared. We're going to come after them. And in that speech, or a related one, he said, listen, we're funded by Iran. I mean, he came right out and admitted it. I was able to pull off the translation. And Khamenei, before the Lebanese election a week ago, said, Lebanon has turned into a field of resistance. But they didn't do that well. but they all celebrate Quds Day, and Hezbollah leader said recently, if Israel continues attacking Iranian targets, Tehran will not hesitate to directly attack Israel. And he should know because he's in bed with Iran. And so here's a picture of this is the Khomeini pulling oil on the fire in the Middle East while Iran is burning. And that's a pretty good graphic of what's going on because there's food riots going on in Iran. There was an article again about the demographic problems in Iran, that young people are leaving at an alarming rate. 1/4 of people who would be able to go into what they call the elites in Iran leave. Well, they don't have babies that are born in Iran then. And so this is a demographic problem. So that's why I think some of these things might happen prophetically more quickly or sooner than we think because the demographic problems. Russia has a demographic problem. Iran has a demographic problem. China has a big demographic problem. And Japan, they lost, I don't know, 700,000 people population this last year because of their demographic problem. And so the other thing that Hezbollah did was they tweeted out, this was out of place. So this is a picture of a meeting with Tedros back in 2017 of the World Health Organization. What do you see in the background there in the conference room? The Hindu Shiva goddess. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Remember when they put that stuff up on the Empire State Building, the goddess of destruction? So here is a tweet from somebody in Lebanon talking about a new Hezbollah video showing a glance of what is likely the Abu Mahdi missile. It's a cruise ship. It's an anti-ship missile, but it's nice of Lebanon or the Iranians, they always post these videos and you can kind of figure out what they have and what's operational. And this thing has a range of about, I think it's about 700, 800 miles or 1,000 miles. It's pretty amazing. I mean, it can go to, if it went from Lebanon, and they think they have these now in Lebanon, which is the point. So if it can reach all the way to Crete, it certainly can reach what? Any place in Israel. And they're improving the guided missile aspects of this. Again, Assad was in Tehran. Here's an article from the Financial Times about disruption in food markets. I thought this was the one about Iran, but I guess not. It's Nabka Day when they celebrate the oppression, the catastrophe. It's called the Catastrophe, Nabka, of Israel coming to be as a nation. Okay, so here's the IDF. The IDF puts together a thing called Chariots of Fire, which is a month-long military exercise to simulate attacking targets in Iran. That started a week or so ago. The United States is participating in it. There's even reports that U.S. aircraft and tankers are participating in this. Here's the Israel Hayom report about Chariots of Fire. And Israel has great military and Air Force capabilities. Here's the IDF tweet back and that this was going to go on, the largest military exercise in decades that they've had. Here's a little video that they put together to kind of show some of the things they're doing. So this is a big military exercise. As I said, the United States is participating in some respects of this. And they're holding this throughout Israel in different parts of Israel. But then one problem came up because of the internal situation. I showed you the intelligence reports and strategic assessments of Israel that says we have an internal problem in the Arab cities in Israel. And so they were supposed to do part of this up in the third largest Arab city. They were supposed to have this simulated war with Hezbollah, and they canceled it because they didn't want to offend the Arabs that are there right now. So there's a lot of internal turmoil. Now, something else happened. This happened about a week ago. There was a clash over Syria. So this was about the 13th of, I think, Friday the 13th. Israel attacked some Iranian targets in Syria with several aircraft. They shot about 24 missiles. The reports are that they shot down, anti-missile batteries shot down about 2/3 of those missiles. The rest hit their targets. There were a number of people, Iranian and Syrian, killed. But the interesting thing that happened was that, here's a graphic that shows how many of the missiles were shot down and destroyed before they could hit their target. But as the Israeli jets were exiting the Syrian area, they shot these from off the coast. But the Russians, who control their S-300 batteries in Syria, they shot at the Israeli airplanes. Now, they didn't get radar lock. Remember that from Top Gun, how they get radar lock. So these are the S-300s that they have there. They're controlled by Russia, but it's sort of a message to Israel, like, you need to support us more in Ukraine, or we're going to start coming after you when you come and attack these Iranian targets. But Russia's withdrawing. There have been many reports in the media over the last week and a half that Russia is withdrawing troops and equipment from Syria, actually even abandoning some of the many bases they have in Syria to take them to Ukraine because they need the help, the personnel in Ukraine. Well, they're turning those bases over to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. They're not turning them over to Syria, they're turning them over to the IRGC, which is significant. So here's a map of some of the Russian, the white, blue, red circle is their military bases. This week, Danny Gantz gave a speech at the Institute for Policy and Strategy at Reichman University in Netanya. And he said, I'll just give you a quick little summary of what he said, because it was pretty significant. And now I'm not seeing. Well, I can kind of remember what he said. So here's what he said. The cost of attacking Iran now is never going to be lower than it is if we do it right now. The cost of what we ought to spend to attack Iran, and they're maybe 3 weeks away from having enough uranium to build a nuclear bomb, it's never going to be cheaper to do it than now. So the question is, are they going to do it now? Now, look, this is why I talk about logistics. There are logistical problems with that. They have these F-35s. F-35s only have a limited range. They have a battle operational range of about, like if they get in a dogfight and that type of thing, of about 800 or 900 kilometers, which is 600, 700 miles. They can operate and fight in that, and then they run out of fuel and they're no good. So for them to go all the way from Israel to Iran and do bombing, they don't have the fuel. They barely have enough fuel to get there. They don't have the external drop tanks yet because they haven't really been manufactured. And they don't have enough refueling tankers. So they've asked for tankers from the US, but they're saying they probably won't get them because of developmental problems that we're having. They won't get those till 2025. So I don't know if Israel's going to attack Tehran with a big military attack in the very near future, but they are going to continue their sabotage attacks that they've been doing for quite some time. But the F-35 is a great fighter. Israel's enhanced it way beyond, I think, the capabilities that we have in America with our own aircraft that we design. but it has a limited range. And so they don't have the refueling tankers logistically to use aircraft like this in attacks. They have some F-16s, F-15s, which have a little bit longer range. But again, they don't have, without a big refueling capacity in the air, if they have that, they can keep these things in the air for 12 hours, which is pretty significant. But without that, they can't keep them in the air that long. So I'm not sure that they're going to make a big attack, but they're certainly going to do something because Israel's getting very close, Iran's getting very close to a nuclear weapon. And I'll close with this. There was a very interesting article in the Tehran Times. Iran moves ahead with regional diplomacy. And you see the graphic there of the Middle East with all the different flags of all the different countries. And it kind of stops at Jordan and Syria. But when you go to the online version, you see a little bit more. And I think this one got by the censors because what it shows is, it shows Israel having all of Israel. That's kind of interesting. I don't think I'm sure they cropped that when they put it in the paper, but on the website you can still see that there's the flag over Israel and it's not broken down by West Bank and Israel. And so maybe we could say, listen, Iran knows what's going to happen eventually. If you dig into their own websites, they show this. Because we know what happens, all these things work out. So that's just a very brief, I know it's not brief, but it's kind of a brief summary of all the stuff that's going on. And I have dozens and dozens of slides that I didn't get to because right now, it is, as I said when I started this, it is catastrophe upon catastrophe. And it's going to be a very difficult time in the world for some time. Some places worse than others. But we know that this is how the world's going to be as we get closer and closer to the Lord's return. So let's look forward to that. Don't be afraid, but act wisely. Because it's needed now. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We pray that you will keep us mindful of the fact that you have not given us a spirit of fear, but one of power, and pray that you will give us opportunities in this time when things are really certainly appearing to spin out of control, that we can use that as an opportunity to share the glorious gospel of Jesus Christ with our friends and neighbors. Pray you'll give us those opportunities. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.